G'day, Ziggy D here with another Diablo 3 Preparing for Reaper of Souls guide. In this video I'm going to be giving you guys my Wizard, Archon, Spec and farming route for farming Paragon experience. Since Paragon XP is the main thing that we can take forward with us into Reaper of Souls, there's not too much else that we know about yet that's going to be too useful. That's what this spec and route is based around, maxing out that Paragon XP. However, because of the large number of trash mobs kills that we get with this sort of spec and route, we also get a pretty decent amount of legendaries, which is always fun. I like to incorporate some legendary magic finding in wherever I can in these sorts of farming routes. When you are playing on higher monster power settings, most of your legendary drops will come from burning through hordes of trash mobs, and this spec and route really does that well. So before we get on with the spec and route, I just want to briefly mention the gear for this build. This set that you currently see me farming in was done on a 100 million gold budget, and it turned out really well. If you want to learn about how to build yourself a similar set, then I produced a separate gearing video with experienced set builder and streamer Good Idea Gaming. If you want to check out that video, then check out the annotation, or check out the link in the description. So let's talk about the spec. I decided to go for an Archon Wizard as it's the cheapest build that will still get you a ton of Paragon XP. The other most popular spec for Wizard is the CM Wizard, but from my research, CM builds require a lot of very expensive attack speed items to become viable. Archon, on the other hand, can scale well to almost any budget while still being really effective. To give you an idea of what sort of scaling you're looking at, my set clears MP5 to MP6 pretty efficiently, and it was built in only half an hour with a budget of 100 million gold. Under 50 million, you'll probably get MP4 to MP5 easily, so it scales up pretty exponentially in terms of cost, but you can get to MP10 on like a 500 million budget or something like that, depending on how much time you put into actually building the set. So, with an Archon spec, your goal is to spend all of your time in Archon form, dishing out tons of damage. As such, our skill set is designed to boost our power while in Archon form, or to get us back into Archon form as quickly as possible if something does happen to go wrong. So let's first talk about Archon mode and the buffs that we'll use. First up, we use Archon Improved Archon with the Improved Archon rune for just straight up additional damage. You know, that's going to really help us out with our farming speed after all. Now we also use Energy Armor with Pinpoint Barrier. This gives us extra crit chance, and crit chance is very important in this build for a number of reasons, and it also gives us a good damage boost. Next up, we use Magic Weapon with the Blood Magic rune. Additional life leech will keep us alive from our very high damage output in Archon form, so it works really well in this build. And then finally we use Familiar with the Spark Flint rune, and this gives us additional damage again, which of course helps out with life leech as well, and just mowing down those trash mobs, those high MP trash mobs, as quickly as possible. So basically we activate all three buffs before going into Archon form, and then whenever they wear off we can right click the little Archon icon to disable it, and then we can just reapply the buffs before going back into Archon mode, but I'll talk a bit more about that later on. So now let's talk about resetting the Archon cooldown, the skills that we use to use that. Now Shock Pulse with the Living Lightning rune will be our main attack, but we only use it to get back into Archon form. We don't really use it for any other reason. Now the reason we use this is because the lightning bolts travel very slowly and hit a lot of times and can crit very quickly, and combined with one of our passives a little bit later on you guys will learn about, that helps us out a lot. Next up, we use Frost Nova with Deep Freeze, which freezes, if you freeze 5 mobs at once, it boosts your crit chance by 10% for a short time, which is usually enough to get out a ton of crits really quickly with Shock Pulse to reset our Archon cooldown and get back into Archon form ASAP. So, next up, the passives, and this is where that other stuff starts to make a bit more sense. Critical Mass is our first passive. It works with Shock Pulse and our various other crit chance buffs to reset Archon's cooldown if we lose it. So if you go into Archon form and you happen to run into an elite pack that's a bit more difficult, and you take a while to kill them, you lose Archon form, and maybe you still have half of your cooldown left, you're not much use when you're out of Archon form on an Archon Wizard. So by having Critical Mass, we just get out a bunch of crits really quickly, and then that resets our Archon form. We can go straight back into Archon form nice and quickly. Now it also, as a little side note, resets our Arcane Blast while we're in Archon form. So while you're lasering stuff down, your Arcane Blast will come up all of the time, and whenever there's mobs in melee range, you can keep blasting them. Next up is Galvanizing Ward. This gives us some additional regen, which is just a minor buff, but mainly it's for the increased duration on energy armor, so we don't need to refresh it so often. The other two buffs we use last 5 minutes each, but this one by default only lasts 60 seconds, but with Galvanizing Ward, that brings that up to 120 seconds, so we can spend more time in Archon form without slowing down our farming, so that's pretty important. And then the final passive is Glass Cannon. This passive is a bit of a trade-off, obviously, because you're going to lose some defensive stats for some offensive stats, but it's really efficient exchange of resources. You're losing 10% of your mitigation stats for 15% increased offensive power, so it's really efficient trade-off. More damage also means more life leech, so most of the time it's actually a pretty great trade-off, and even though you're losing some mitigation, you're getting additional life leech potential, so that's really good. Alternatives, however, if you're having some trouble surviving on the MP that you're trying to go for, this will involve playing around with some MPs and playing around with some passives, but alternatives are Blur or Temporal Flux for a bit of a damage boost. Temporal Flux works with the Archon beam to slow enemies, and Blur just straight up reduces melee damage taken. However, with Archon form, I think dealing the damage and killing things more quickly is a bit more important, so I recommend Glass Cannon most of all. Now, let's talk a bit about the method of how you actually go about using this build. Pretty simple stuff, basically. First, you pop all of your buffs and then go into Archon form whenever you are near some trash mobs. So, if you just wait until you get to your first trash mob pack and then pop your buffs and then Archon form, you'll maximize that cooldown as much as possible. Then make sure to kill quite a few trash mobs before you move on to your first elite, or you will likely lose Archon form on that first elite. You can build up kind of a bit of a buffer on the actual time that you can stay in Archon mode, as long as you kill a good chunk of trash mobs first. And if you happen to bump in an elite pack straight up as soon as you come off the waypoint and pop your Archon form, you'll notice that you lose Archon form pretty quickly. So it's a good idea to run around and kill a few trash mobs first. However, if you do happen to lose Archon form and the cooldown is still up, then find a pack of at least 5 mobs, freeze them, and then cast Lightning Pulse until your cooldown is finished. This should be really quickly with the extra 10% crit chance from that, and we're also getting 5% from our energy armor buff as well. So we get quite a bit of crit chance on this build, and this is why crit chance on gear is also quite important, but you'll see plenty about that in the other gearing guide that I made. So, next up, you make sure to refresh your buffs before you go back into Archon form. So whenever you lose Archon form, or whenever you're about to pop Archon form, get in the habit of first putting up all of your buffs, otherwise you're going to have to be cancelling Archon form later, and that's just going to slow you down overall. And then, finally, if your buffs do happen to wear off while you're in Archon form, and this will happen when you're having a good run, simply right-click on the icon, so the little small icon above your school bar, and that will cancel it, and it'll actually take you out of Archon form. Kind of a little hidden trick there. And basically then you can recast your buffs and go back into Archon form and start over, and keep on farming. So, next up, let's talk about the farming route that we're going to be going to max out our Paragon XP. Now, the methodology of getting a lot of Paragon XP really quickly is generally to get 5 stacks as quickly as possible, and then to farm huge amounts of trash mobs on the highest MP possible, monster power possible. So basically, this can even involve skipping some elite packs. Once you've got those first 5 stacks, you're going to get most of your experience from the trash mobs when you're on a high MP with 5 stacks of Nephilim Valor. So, as such, we start off in Festering Woods and grab our first 3 to 5 stacks here. There are 2 guaranteed elites in each of the mini dungeons, so you want to look for these first. You'll also occasionally get an event for another free stack. In the Festering Woods zone itself, 1 to 3 elites will spawn here, so it's quite possible to get 5, or you'll most of the time at least get 3, and that's pretty fine. If you do happen to get 3 or 4 stacks really quickly, then you actually don't want to sit around in Festering Woods looking for another stack or 2. Like, even if those elites are there, the time it's spent taken looking for those is just going to slow you down your farming overall, slow down your XP income. So, to combat this, we simply go to Leoric's Manor. Leoric's Manor has 1 to 2 really fast Nephilim Valor stacks, so essentially as long as you get 3 fast ones in Festering Woods, you're better off going to Leoric's Manor. But occasionally you'll bump into some extra elites in Festering Woods, and you can skip Leoric's Manor altogether. Now, there is, you basically went from the waypoint in Leoric's Manor, you want to head backwards up the stairs and clear the manor and the front yard area. There is 1 guaranteed elite in the front yard area always, and there's also a shrine there as well. I'm pretty sure that's like a 100% spawn on the shrine as well, so make sure to grab that. And there's also a very high chance that an elite will spawn inside the building, or that a second elite pack will spawn in the front yard as well. I've actually gotten 3 packs of elites in Leoric's Manor quite often as well, so you'll get those extra Nephilim Valor stacks you need to reach 5 pretty quickly. So once we have preferably 5 stacks, though if you get 4 and it's going to take a long time to get the 5th stack, don't worry about it too much, we're going to head straight to the Fields of Misery. This zone and 2 of its dungeons, the Scavenger's Den and Decaying Crypt, have some of the highest XP trash mobs in the game. They actually also drop more loot overall thanks to being the more difficult variants of these sorts of monsters. For example, you'll run into different coloured zombies too, for example, comparing to the Weeping Hollow, and these always drop more loot overall. So you're going to get more legendaries, you're going to get some more items and stuff like that, which is a nice little side bonus. Now remember that the real moneymaker here in the Fields of Misery is the Decaying Crypt. It is by far the best dungeon in the game now in terms of XP. So if you are actually playing with a group that includes some barbs with high run speed, so Whirlwind Barbarians for example, then it's worthwhile having them scout out for a game first, each run that includes this dungeon before actually starting the run. So you have each one of the barbs create a new game, scout out, try and find this Decaying Crypt, and if they find one, then you farm that zone and go through, and you already know it's there, so you'll max out that XP because you'll get tons of XP in that, and ARCHON works really well in there as well. Just as an extra tip, there's the little vomiting decaying cadavers. Let them vomit out a couple of zombies first. You actually get XP for all of the zombies I recently found out, but it's in terms of time efficiency, it's worth it just to let them vomit their first round of 3 zombies, then kill them off and continue on. So I decided to remove the Weeping Hollow from this run, as the XP you get from it is quite a bit lower, and there are far fewer drops from the mobs in this zone compared to Fields of Misery. Based on my testing, you're better off simply restarting and focusing on Fields of Misery only, even though you have to build up 5 stacks each time. So it seems like the XP difference between Weeping Hollow and Fields of Misery just meant that it was more effective to do Fields of Misery and get more of those Fields of Misery dungeons in whenever you can. Of course though, fun is the key operator in maxing out your Paragon XP, and I think this is something people tend to gloss over a little bit too often. If you do get bored of just doing Fields of Misery, then feel free to tack on Cemetery and head down to Weeping Hollow. Just make sure you have your 5 Nephilim Valor stacks before you head on into these zones. Anyway, I think that just about covers it. Feel free to ask me any questions you have about this spec or this farming route or anything like that, or any other preparing for Reaper of Souls questions you might have. I'll be making plenty more videos on gearing up and kitting up and getting ready and farming and any sorts of news we have for Reaper of Souls. So make sure if you're not already subscribed to hit that subscribe button. I'm Ziggy D, and thanks for watching. So what sort of Archon Wizard do you think we can build for 100 million budget?
I think you should be able to get a pretty good Archon Wizard. I'm gonna guess probably between 240 to 270,000 DPS. Probably around 40,000 health, which is usually what I like to build all my Archon Wizards. Generally around 37 to 40,000 health, and you're probably looking at like 600 to 700 all resistance. So you're probably gonna have like 10 to 20% more DPS than like a 30 to 40 million budget Archon Wizard, which is what I usually build.